Thank you for coming today. We frankly were just really delighted with the number of people who have chosen to come, and media has not helped by some of the attention that they've made about, it's all terrible out there. I'd like to start the program by acknowledging, as we always do, the Aboriginal elders, and in particular, I'd like to pay tribute to those who are serving in the ADF. One of the most moving welcome to countries I've ever shared was at RAF headquarters late last year, where there was a function on, and an Aboriginal senior warrant officer got up and spoke very movingly, and he said, look, what you may not understand is it really does mean a lot to us when people actually acknowledge our history. So sometimes I sit and think, it's all just procedural, but could I particularly pay tribute to those who are serving in the ADF. Today we have the privilege of being given a very, very thorough presentation, because I've had the privilege of previewing it by Captain Chris Skinner, and he will be introduced. Chris Skinner is now a board member as well as a longer standing member of RUSI, and I'd like to hand over to Ron Lyons, our event coordinator, who will introduce Chris, and then after Chris speaks, we'll have a vote of thanks from Commodore Mike Flynn. And Ron, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first of our monthly lecture series for 2022. The overall theme for RUSI's activities this year is Improving Australia's Regional Security, and the title of today's lecture is Nuclear-Powered Submarines and Other AUKUS Technologies for the ADF. And as Michael has said, it'll be presented by Captain Chris Skinner, RAN retired. The recent announcement of the AUKUS agreement for sharing advanced technologies amongst Australia, United Kingdom and the USA has been headlined by the switch to a nuclear-powered submarine force for the RAN. And it not only gave us a brand new acronym in AUKUS, which I think possibly was designed to divert our attention from the other acronym that we've been living with for the last 2.5 years. But Christopher has been advocating nuclear power for some time, and this lecture will update his previous research in the light of AUKUS and the formation of the Nuclear-Powered Submarine Task Force. Naturally, the nuclear component was certainly evocative and seized upon by the media and commentators, to the distraction perhaps of other elements of the agreement. The other significant technologies that Chris will cover include cyber warfare, quantum computing, artificial intelligence and advanced undersea surveillance. The lecture, in terms of nuclear power, will cover defence capability and, for nuclear submarines, the history of nuclear propulsion, nuclear fuel cycle, the role of Australia's nuclear agencies and other specific factors relating to the choice of a nuclear submarine platform and the possible acquisition strategy. All of these issues will be woven through what we do in our program in 2022. Christopher Skinner served for 30 years in the Royal Australian Navy as a weapons and electrical engineering officer in 6 surface warships in SEATO, the Vietnam War and in the Northwest Indian Ocean surveillance. His shore postings included involvement in the Oberon-class submarine weapons update project, secondment to the US Naval Sea Systems Command to conduct first-of-class trials of a joint frigate project, and he was the initial project director of the Anzac frigate project of 10 ships for the navies of Australia and New Zealand. Christopher's involvement in submarine matters is more recent, and perhaps presciently he registered the business name Nuclear Propulsion Roadmap for Australia in 2019. As Michael said, Christopher is a board member of the Institute, and ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome our speaker today.
I'd like to thank both our President and Ron for their kind introductory comments. I'd also like to acknowledge what is going on right now in Tonga, which has been absolutely devastated by their volcanic eruption, and the armed forces of both New Zealand and Australia have been very active indeed. The RAAF were in there right away as soon as they could get an aircraft in to clear all the ash off the runway for other aircraft to use. The New Zealand Navy are there with huge load of drinking water and a desalination plant, and HMAS Adelaide is en route with enormous stocks of Australian aid stores, Chinook and other helicopters to distribute them around the islands, their landing craft to go over the beach if they need to, if the port facilities are too damaged or inaccessible, and altogether a very fine effort. And it's something that I very much recall because this is the 40th anniversary year of the Falklands War. And that's significant in a number of respects, which I won't dwell on now, except to say that nuclear submarines played a very big part in that, and I think we should be conscious of it. My talk is just a slideshow with me giving a commentary. If I flip past some of the slides too quickly for you to read all of the text, please don't be too concerned. I'll bring out the main points, and I believe that the same set of slides with my own voiceover will be available from the RUSI website later this week, which is great. So let's move on. Oh, it didn't work. This is an abstract, which is really what you've just heard already. Oh, too far. AUKUS was announced in the evening of the 15th of September, Universal Time Coordinated, which happened to be 7 a.m. here, by the three leaders of the countries concerned in a most surprising development. But reflecting on it, there were hints that something was afoot. In November of 2020, that is 15 months ago, the Prime Minister, on advice from Navy, was the Capability Acquisition and Support and Sustainment Group, CASG, initiated a parallel investigation on meeting Australia's submarine requirements beyond the life of type extension of the current Collins class, and put Vice Admiral Mead, Jonathan Mead, in charge of that. And most of us thought that, oh, they're going to look at some son of Collins or some derivative, and a few of us hoped that what it might mean was that we could persuade France that at the end of their Souffrant program, which had been called Barracuda, but the first of class is the Souffrant, that at the end of that they would just keep the production line running and produce nuclear submarines for Australia. Such was not to be. The outcome of that 12 months or so investigation by Admiral Mead and his team was AUKUS. And you might say, yes, but it's lots of other things besides submarines. Well, yes it is, but AUKUS would not have happened if there had not been the submarine program. I'm quite sure of that. Now, what you'll see on the screen is, on the left-hand side, the joint leaders' announcement, which is online in the Prime Minister's and Cabinet website. And the bit that I've highlighted is we commit to a shared ambition to support Australia in acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. That was the punchline. And there's quite a simple reason why it's a three-way thing, and that's because the nuclear submarine capability that the Royal Navy has was actually largely based on US Navy technology, which was transferred, the information and so on was transferred to them in the 1960s with a caveat that said you may not transfer this information to any other party without permission from the US. So hence we have this three-way thing. The right-hand side of the screen is the actual agreement itself, which covers the sharing of information on nuclear submarines. That's the front page of I think it's about a 10-page document. It was signed in November, and it says, as I've highlighted, a legally binding framework for the disclosure and use of information, And that, from my own experience of working with the US Navy and US government over a number of years, that's quite predictable that they would require something as explicit as this for this to move forward. And notwithstanding that there have been recent reports that the US Navy's not happy about this, well, they do what they're told just like anybody else in the US government. And if the President has given his imprimatur to this, then it would be a very unusual event for it to be stopped in its tracks, unless, of course, it affects an election in one of the three countries. The first of the technologies is cyber. I would draw your attention to the talk given by Major General Susan Coyle last year. It's available as a video clip on the RUSI website. It's brilliant. She's giving an even more interesting talk in Canberra in a couple of weeks, courtesy of the Australian Computer Society, where I'm a member. But you've got to get to Canberra. That's not being published online. But what she has outlined in management and broad program terms is very, very impressive. And I'm delighted to see it's in such good hands. What's even more interesting is on Friday of last week, as part of the AUKUS discussions of defence and foreign affairs between the UK and Australia, on the side of that, an agreement was signed on cyber collaboration, which was reported over the weekend, didn't get much media attention, but we now have a bilateral cyber technology agreement with the UK. Quantum computing, this is a weird one. That book is one of my library. I've read it, and I still don't understand all the mathematics. It's very challenging theoretically. However, that doesn't mean it isn't going to be a highly powerful technology and that we need to get ready for it. From what I've read, both there and more generally, and in a journal purely on this subject that was published by the Institute of Engineering and Technology, IET, of which I'm a corporate member, where we will see quantum computing is in four main areas, and that is communications, imaging, cyber, and other signal processing, shall I say, sensing and detecting. And what that means for the Australian Defence Force is in 10 years maybe, if you're lucky, we'll have these super cool, highly screened black boxes, which is the quantum computer attached to your radar or your sonar or whatever. We will be able to detect targets at a much lower signal level than currently. The signal to noise ratio opportunities that come with quantum computing will be dramatically different. And what one of them commentators is saying is that stealth aircraft will no longer be stealth once you can use quantum computing. But please don't hold your breath. This is still very much a sort of research lab area in spite of the hype that you will hear about it. Now, artificial intelligence is, on the other hand, very much here today, very much used in all sorts of fashions, both legal and illegal, both military, scientific, governmental and commercial. It's in practically everything we do. The question is, where will it go, and why will AUKUS make it any better than it would have been otherwise? If you want to know more about this, I'm happy to report, as you'll see along the bottom of this slide, the reference from the RUSI library, just over in the corner. This book is in there now, and it's published last year, and it's very authoritative, and what I like about it is it provides an explanation of the link between AI on the one hand, machine learning, and the necessity for big data, huge databases or data files from which the machine learning process can take effect under the rules that the AI has built in and then further adapts. So it's very much with us today. When you start talking about autonomous vehicles of all kinds, AI is absolutely necessity for that. So this is not a whole new breakthrough by any means, as probably you're all aware. The fourth area is undersea sensor technology, and although I'm showing here autonomous underwater vehicles, I'm not trying to say that that's the only form of sensing that is relevant, but they're the ones that seem to get most attention. The bottom one on this screen is the Orca, which is a Boeing machine of some 15 or more metres long, and with a very good endurance, good sensor payload, and is being actively advocated, including by people like me, as an adjunct to manned vehicles, both undersea and surface. And they're not cheap, but compared with manned submarines, they're pretty good value. So getting a bunch of those is great, but you've got to know what is your concept of operations. You've got to set rules of engagement for these things if they're armed. And I'm happy to say that the Australian Defence Department's first cooperative research centre, which is in Queensland, is on trusted autonomous systems. And part of that is technology, how do they make sure they're very likely to do what you want them to do and don't indulge in friendly fire. But it's also an ethical and legal issue as well as a technology issue. So, nuclear propulsion for submarines, which is really the remainder of my talk, but I'm happy to go back to those earlier subjects in the Q&A. Well, there are three main reasons. Unlimited endurance, much higher speed, which is not always a good thing because above a certain level you'll get cavitation, which is a noisy effect where the smooth water flow breaks up and you start to get vacuum bubbles which make a noise and can be detected. But most importantly, when you operate conventional submarines, you have to recharge batteries periodically. And that means sticking up a snorkel, snorting for several hours, during which time you are much more detectable, both in a noise and in a radar and other sense, but you're also limited in your mobility. You're stuck at periscope depth for several hours at a time. That's something that submariners are very conscious of. Other people sort of conveniently forget about it quite often. But for Australia, we have an even greater need, and that is time on task. Our primary areas of operational interest are sometimes a very long way away from where the submarines are based or operate from. And that means transit time is waste time. It's just like aircraft. If you want to put them on task at a long range, you don't get long on task. And this slide, which is taken from a readily available publication from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, don't try and read the fine print, but where those lines point to are areas of quite conceivable operational deployment for Australia. Which brings me to an aside. I still occasionally see people in the media saying, why do we need submarines to protect the Australian coastline? We don't. They're absolutely useless for that. We've got all sorts of other resources, and we've got a very fine Air Force as well that can do that job. Submarines are an offensive and intelligence gathering platform, and the offensive is what makes them a deterrent. There's no deterrence in a defensive capability. Deterrence comes from being able to hit the other guy. Also on this slide, if you go to this publication, the red and orange little boxes show you how much time you'd have on task with a conventional submarine compared with a nuke. And you know, nukes still have some limit in terms of food and other supplies, so it's, you know, they can't go on forever. So there's still some time on task that has to be considered. How did it all happen? Well, Admiral Hyman Rickover, he was a captain at the time, but got rapidly promoted several times in a space of a few years. Became the father, if you like, of nuclear submarines. He also was given a side job to look at nuclear power for electrical generation, which he did, but that wasn't his main concern. He brought to it, and I won't bore you with all the details, but he brought to it a most eccentric and focused and passionate, perhaps even obsessive point of view, which persists today in the US Navy. Anything to do with nukes in the US Navy, that's submarines and aircraft carriers, is still running under the rules that Admiral Rickover set. And when they lost one of their nuclear submarines, the Thresher, they further increased all those safety procedures. And if we were to choose the US option for our nuclear submarines, we would be obliged and we would be very willing and volunteer to follow those sort of rules, and they are far more stringent than anything that the Navy here does, and maybe even than what the Air Force does for all I know, but they certainly leave no margin for she'll be right or, you know, near enough and all that sort of thing. It's very prescriptive. One thing I forgot to mention is partly as a result of that intense oversight, there have been no nuclear accidents in any of the Western navies, and that's important because the Russian Navy has had some nuclear accidents. Now the US Navy's lost 2 nuclear submarines, but neither of them were associated with nuclear power. Brazil's building their own submarines. India has got its first one of its own, having leased a couple of Russian ones. and China, of course, and France has been a long-standing member of the club. This is the sort of rigour that Admiral Rickover applied when he said, oh yeah, it's all very well having a nuclear reactor, but I want to make sure it'll work safely and effectively in a submarine. So he built this rig, and the SG-5 reactor that was going into the USS Nautilus was inside this rig. And there are three factors that he was concerned about. Firstly, the motion of a submarine is not nice, steady on a concrete base as you have for a nuclear power station. It can move quite dramatically when it's being operated. It's not normal. You can break your cup of coffee gets knocked over and stuff like that. It's not necessarily planned, but sometimes you've got to react quickly, and the submarine must be able to take that, including the reactor. Secondly, military vehicles, all of them, submarines no exception, can be attacked and suffer underwater shock from underwater explosions, near misses and so on. And that is a mandatory requirement, first of class, of any new ship class, that they undergo an underwater shock test. And I was on board the USS Oliver Hazard Perry off Roosevelt Roads in the Caribbean, and we had a 5-ton charge a few hundred feet off the ship exploded, and the ship did a full power trial 30 minutes later, which was pretty good proof that it was shockproof. That's the sort of intensity that must be done with a design. But the third factor is that you're worried about the acoustic signature in any submarine, and he wanted to make sure that while they were rocking and rolling and thumping this test rig, that it didn't cause the pumps to become noisy or other operational signature giveaways occurring. Anyway, now the Submarine Institute of Australia, which I'm a member of and until last year was the treasurer of, in its wisdom, not due to my input I might say, I take no credit for it, but I'm delighted it happened, in its wisdom ran a seminar in Canberra in the October of 2019 to look at what would be needed for nuclear propulsion. And the book that's there is what was published from the various talks that were given. And I might add that the current Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Michael Noonan, attended the latter part of that day and gave it a thumbs up. So I'm sure that also contributed to what we now see in AUKUS. Anyway, it's a readable book, and it shows that this didn't all happen overnight, and it wasn't suddenly, a change of direction. This is a typical nuclear submarine. I won't bother going over everything here, but the nice thing about submarines is that it's a very regular shape these days. They're tubes. They're very well engineered cylinders with they're not quite hemispherical, but rounded ends on each end of the tube, and then beyond that on each end are some flooding structures that are not part of the pressure hull. In the bow area, it handles, in this case, some weapons and most importantly a big sonar transducer. And in the stern, it handles part of the propeller drive shaft and the control surfaces. What I put this slide in is to show that all of the left-hand side of the screen is the reactor more or less in the middle, which I'll blow up in a moment, and then all of the steam machinery that drives the turbines and gearing that then drive the propeller, and also other turbo generators to produce the electric power that's used throughout the boat. Now, what's significant I think, is that with the reactor, which was in the middle of that previous slide, it's heavily shielded. It's an unmanned space. You can travel through it or past it, but you don't linger there. There is a radiation level. Every person on a nuclear submarine carries a monitoring badge, and which are monitored routinely. The actual levels experienced by the crew is quite often lower than ambient in above seawater, but the control of who's in the reactor compartment and for how long is very strict. As I say, there's various shielding around it. But just after that is the manoeuvring room, which is where the entire propulsion side of the submarine is controlled from, and which, under both US and UK rules, there will be a nuclear qualified engineering officer on watch 24/7 in port, in dry dock, at sea, 24/7 forever. From when that reactor is first made active until that reactor is shut down finally and disposed of, there will be a qualified nuclear engineer in charge, and there will be a senior NCO equally qualified in the same compartment, and there'll be 4 or 5 other people who are either in there some of the time and or going around the various other compartments, keeping a very frequent eye on the condition of the plant. Now, I come to the nuclear fuel cycle because it's interesting and often ignored. And I might give you an example of how this is being ignored, is that the end of the process, when the submarine reaches its end of life, it's decommissioned, it's marked for disposal. During the Cold War, that's where it stopped. The Russians towed them all up to the Arctic and let them just rot. The Brits parked them all in Scotland, and they were pretty much left to rot as well. The US cuts them up, takes the reactor compartment and literally buries it in a great big hole in the desert area, but none of them completed the task. We, Australia, cannot contemplate being so remiss. And I'm pleased to say that only today was announced that the UK has started cutting up its first of its 21 decommissioned nuclear submarines. The US, by the way, still does not have a geological repository to put the end spent fuel and any other high-level material. They're still arguing about it. They've got a temporary storage. The UK has got 3 sites in Cumbria and Wales that they're talking to the local community, and Australia's actually ahead of both of them. We've selected a spot on Eyre Peninsula. It's being appealed, of course, as all these things always are, but we're actually ahead of them. So under AUKUS, we can actually start telling the other 2 countries how they might like to do this. But look, the list there of all the things that have to happen are just normal process. But what I'm illustrating, I hope, is it's a complete process, cradle to grave. And this diagram, which you won't be able to read, illustrates that. You mine it on the left, you go through various stages of refining it, putting it into the right sort of configuration and containment. You use it. Eventually you have to refuel or defuel. You then got to reprocess the fuel, because typically with the sort of technology that's currently being used in submarines, there's a lot of the fuel that's not actually consumed, that's mixed in with spent fuel and the fission products. And that's wasteful, and it also makes much greater bulk of material to be disposed of. So it's not a responsible or sustainable way to go. What ANSTO has been doing is sending it off to France and most recently to the UK, where that post-processing is done to take out the fuel that's still useful, and then they send back the residual stuff to us to deal with. At Lucas Heights there are ponds with lots of this stuff sitting there, but it'll all go to Eyre Peninsula and get properly disposed of in due course. So here are some of the infrastructure that's needed. I won't dwell on this one because I think I've probably covered it. One thing though I didn't mention is when you take the fuel out, even though it's no longer in a fissionable configuration, so you spread it apart so it doesn't continue the chain reaction, it will go on emitting heat for several years. And that's due to the residual radioactivity of the fission products. So that has to be stuck in a cooling pool for months or years until it's down to a level where the heat has dropped, but it also shows that short-term or short-lived radioactive products have diminished their radiation levels. So I won't dwell on that. Now the one big thing, apart from having that watch-keeping 24/7 that I mentioned, the other absolute necessity for a nuclear reactor is you've got to keep it cool all the time. And that means even when you're on shore power and the shore power fails, or you're stuck in a dry dock like this floating dock, you must cool it. Now, what happened in Fukushima was that due to a tsunami that exceeded their design aims, the cooling stopped. And so, quite naturally, the reactor overheated. It first of all deforms, it sort of loses its integrity, and then it melts down completely, and then you've got a real problem because it's where does the radioactive material get to? That's absolutely your worst possible nightmare, and so having not only a cooling source but a backup and maybe even a triple backup is absolutely essential 24/7. Now, construction of nuclear submarines. I mentioned that the pressure hull is a proven capability. We've built submarines here already. The pressure hull is a tube. It's a right cylinder. It's divided into sections for convenience, and then the sections are welded together under very stringent conditions. And it's designed to take pressures up to several hundred metre depth, crush depth. But it's not actually that much different to a chemical plant. Well, you've got these big retort reactor vessels. They're usually vertical rather than horizontal, but it's the same sort of construction. They're dealing with an internal pressure rather than an external pressure, so you know the metallurgy is not quite the same, but nevertheless we do know in this country how to do that sort of stuff. So this is what a submarine building line can look like, but alternatively each of those sections, by the way the Astute has got 8 sections, and some are shorter than others, but each of them has got a function, and then there's a well-designed join where the pipework and cabling and so on is carefully planned to cover those joins. But it's a much more predictable and manageable environment in shipbuilding than building surface ships or oil rigs or stuff like that. Here's an example of a submarine where you built this raft with all of the gear on it outside of the section of the submarine. You can do all the testing, you can run it in, you can do whatever you like, you can have training, you've got all the accessibility, and then you plug it into this section, And that gives two advantages. You've got the advantage of the accessibility, but you can also insulate it from the pressure hull so that the acoustic signature is not adversely affected by whatever's running on this plant. There's another aspect too for the forward end of the submarine. You can do this with the combat system. And if the US, for example, as we had with the attack class that we've now cancelled, Lockheed Martin were doing the combat system, and they would do this exact process, because then Naval Group wouldn't get to see what the technology was that was going into the combat system. In other words, there are, I perhaps shouldn't use the word Chinese walls, but that's what they are in terms of sensitivity of technology. Anyway, it's all a well-proven process. We've done it before in South Australia. What we haven't done is the nuclear stuff. Now, just to illustrate what I've just said, this is a very nice diagram of what the pressurised water reactor, nuclear reactor machine is all about. The left-hand side, that box, is the reactor section. Everything to the right-hand side is the use of steam for turbines to drive the propeller through the gearing and to drive turbo generators and so on. And you'll note that there are two cooling circuits. There's the primary one that's mainly inside the reactor compartment. There's the secondary one, which is where the steam is generated and used. And then there's a seawater tertiary one, which is the condenser. Now, the Australian Navy and merchant shipping have been using steam-powered ships for 100+ years. And this is, all of the right-hand side of this is really old, familiar technologies. There's nothing unusual about everything in that secondary circuit. So I stress that because people get this feeling that it's all brand new. It's not. Now, okay, just to illustrate what I've just said, this is a French shipyard. DCNS was the previous name of Naval Group. That thing in the middle is the reactor section for a French nuclear submarine, and you've got the stern section on the left and the bow section on the right, and they're going to plug it in and weld it up, do all the X-raying and all that sort of stuff, connect up all the cables and pipe work, test them all, etc. So it shows what can be done. There are regulatory needs beyond just what Admiral Rickover had to say. The authority in Australia is the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, ARPANSA. They're a very expert and competent organisation. They've already done lots of things in this sort of way. The reprocessed fuel that's coming back from the UK, ARPANSA sets all the rules and guidelines and monitors it all. They're independent from ANSTO, and they would be independent from Defence. They are an independent regulator, and they're set up as such. However, they don't have any naval experience, and so what I'm suggesting is, as has happened in the US, that we would need perhaps a subset or some sort of specialist group with naval uniformed and civilian engineers who are nuclear qualified. But, you know, that's organisational stuff. This isn't moving. Now, the workforce, big challenge, but we've been through this before. When we introduced the Oberon class submarines, we didn't have any submariners at all. And so we worked with the RN. A lot of them were happy to transfer on a permanent basis. Some of them came over for one or two tours and so on. And I'm quite sure the same thing will happen. There's a transitional plan that's needed. It's not do we have them or don't we have them. And it's nothing to do with whether we've got a nuclear power industry as such. It's to do with people who understand submarines, who understand the additional requirements of nuclear propulsion, and whom we trust to meet our own standards, which we would largely model on those already being used elsewhere. So I won't dwell on that. Part of the training, though, does need a live reactor, and you can't do that at Lucas Heights. It's not the sort of reactor where you can go through, full power down to zero and back up to full power in a couple of minutes, which you've got to be able to do with a submarine reactor, but you don't do that with the Opal, and you don't do that with a lot of power stations either. So you need a dynamically authentic reactor. Now, you can do a lot of things with simulation, but it's not quite the full story. This is what Indian Navy's doing with their submariners. This is their training reactor. Gives you an idea of the size and scale. Now, what's all this mean for possible adoption of nuclear power in the civil sector? Well, the Australian Labor Party as opposition have very impressively given their full support for AUKUS with 3 caveats. Firstly, it does not breach the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Secondly, it does not require the build-up of a nuclear power industry more generally. And the third one I just forget, but anyway, they're all highly reasonable, and it was very impressive to see them come on board with AUKUS with such short notice and in such a positive way. Having said that, if we get into the nuclear submarine business, then sooner or later people will say, well, what could we do with that? Well, it just so happens that small modular reactors are imminent. They're of a similar power level and similar technology to submarine reactors. And the reason they're attractive, well, there are several reasons, but the main one is you can build them in a factory. And that's what the next slide, no, not quite. That's what this slide shows, is one of these small modular reactors actually being transported. The unit on the right there stands vertically. All of the working part of the reactor's inside that structure. It's got a natural cooling mechanism so that even if the power fails to the pumps, it'll cool itself by convection. And it is being built right now and is likely to be adopted by a number of countries. The RollsRoyce have got their own similar version. And RollsRoyce, by the way, are the suppliers of the UK submarine reactors. And just published recently, the University of Queensland, Professor Stephen Wilson, who, by the way, is giving a talk in Sydney next month, they've published a report saying requirements for operational nuclear plants in Australia from 2030. There was a graduate study that was done in UQ. And I asked him when I went to an earlier presentation, could we have nuclear submarines if we don't already have a nuclear energy industry? And he hadn't really thought about it before, but he said, yeah, there would clearly be synergies because the manufacturing submarines, large pressure vessels, are very much similar to what you need for small modular reactors. That's an aside. Here's some time frames, and I won't bore you with all the nitty-gritty of this, but the big discussion has been, will there be a gap between the end of the life of type extension of Collins, which is in the middle of this rather busy table. The left-hand side are the dates which the Prime Minister mentioned, but which increasingly people are seeing as it need to be accelerated. And that's feasible if we are a little flexible about what is built where and how it all comes together. But also, something that I've been advocating is that we do need to consider leasing nuclear submarines from whichever of the two countries is the source for the main new program, but to lease them fully crewed, not bare boats with, now we've got to find qualified crew, but fully crewed, operate out of Fremantle or Perth, the Fleet Base West, Stirling, but with gaps in their crew, which we would put Australians into increasingly until we met the qualification level of that Navy. Not ours, because we don't have them yet, but the qualification level that would apply in the Navy that's providing those leases. And if you did that, and I'm talking about leasing 3 boats every 2 years, then the numbers down the right-hand side is the submarine force, which still has a bit of a sort of a low point, but that's the sort of number crunching that the task force that's underway now needs to get its head around. But the idea of leasing, which some people have sort of written off, is valid, and I have seen reports saying it's worthy of consideration. Okay, conclusions. I won't go through all of this stuff, but if, as I think we will, go with the UK Astute class, it figured, by the way, pretty heavily in the joint statement from the AUKUS talks last week. It's right up front in the joint ministerial statement. The Astute has a number of advantages. It's a smaller crew. It runs to a UK culture which the Australian Navy still follows, etc. Then we would expect that the UK would build the reactor and the propulsion plant. That's all the after part of the submarine. The US would build the plug-in combat system gear, and probably, why not just get Lockheed Martin to roll over from the attack class to building these. And we'd put them all together and assemble it in South Australia. That's doable. There are a lot of things. I'll leave it for the Q&A. Sorry, wrong way. But the other conclusion, this is my last slide, is AUKUS is a technology agreement. Yes, it talks about 4 new areas of technology that are very important for the Australian Defence Force and more generally, but it wouldn't have happened if this had not started as a submarine investigation, and the actual text of the announcements, plural, are all very much focused on nuclear submarines. Now, some people might say, oh, gee whiz, you know, we need stuff, as did Peter Jennings of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He said, oh, we can't wait that long. We need B-21 strike aircraft right now, which I agree with. You know, we sadly missed the F-111s. They were brilliant aircraft, and we ran them brilliantly, and we armed them with Harpoon, which nobody else had ever done, and that was really good. And that's a big gap in our capability. But we've got to get into the nuclear propulsion business, and it's doable, and we've got the best chance we've ever had to do it this way. For RUSI, though, the goal that President Michael Howe has set is a number, but includes, for me, to work with academia and industry to talk about technology innovation. Nuclear is a part of that, so are the other AUKUS technologies, and I think we've got a very exciting year ahead of us as we take all this forward, keeping an eye on what AUKUS has brought us and how we can work with it. So without further ado, are there any questions?
Thank you. Would you please state your name and your affiliation, please, prior to asking your question.
John Hitchin, RUSI. My question is, you mentioned leasing boats from either UK or America.
Yep.
with their own national crew.
Yep.
Would the boat be a HMAS, or a HMS, or a USS?
No, they'd be USS and they'd be HMS. They would be commissioned boats of that country, which we are paying for them to base in Western Australia and to offer training billets in those submarines for Australian submariners to achieve the qualifications we need for our own nuclear submarines.
Thank you.
I'm a journalist, a freelance journalist, but we take this under Chatham House rules.
I'm not insisting on a Chatham House rule.
Okay, all right.
Our president may do, but I'm not.
Okay, good. You didn't mention the elephant in the room alternative for the construction program, which is simply to pay $2 or $3 billion to the United States to increase its capacity for Virginias to 3 a year and take one of their Virginias every year.
Agreed, and I'm sure that the UK, in spite of all the worry about, oh gee, they're flat out in Barrow, would be quite happy to take our money and build them there. The Prime Minister has said they'll be built in Adelaide. Well, we'll build as much as we can in Adelaide, but if we suddenly got into a hot shooting war in Taiwan or someplace, we would look at those other options. But the task force has that as part of their remit to look at that possibility. I don't think it's what we would see now, but it's feasible.
Malcolm Brown, former Officer Training Unit Association. My only question is there's almost a 20-year gap between the first of our own nuclear submarines. Well, in terms of development of science, technology, 20 years is a long, long time. It struck me when I was observing what happened in the Falklands War, how the exocet missile could wipe out an entire capital ship. And I wondered, after the demonstrated exocet missile, why surface ships weren't viable at all. And I'm wondering whether in 20 years' time technology will have advanced so that possibly a submarine might be identified by satellite, and we might send a missile from some continent somewhere, pinpoint where the submarine is, and blow it to bits.
That's not impossible, but one has to look in these sort of technological developments about probabilities that things can happen and what sort of force structure do we need, assuming there will be attrition and we will have losses. The detectability of submarines from satellites is occurring already. Phosphorescence caused in some parts of the world in warmer seas is traceable. But then pressing a button and having a missile, ballistic or even slower cruise, even hypersonic cruise, to get there and deal with the submarine is not yet proven. If it is proven, we have to, have another look at our plan. But if you don't start, you're never going to get there. So this is the starting process. At any point, we can say, well, it was a nice idea in 2021, but now we are 5 years later and things have changed. I mean, that's the name of the game.
David Deasy, RUSI. Is there a role, given the time frame and ignoring budgetary considerations, is there a role for additional diesel submarines to tide us over that 20-year gap, given that the strategic plan was originally to double the size of the submarine force? I'll
put that in two parts. The doubling the size of the submarine force, there was a referenced paper by former Rear Admiral Peter Briggs on why we needed a lot more, and you know, we even had Professor Hugh White saying we needed 24, not 12. But look, the numbers in the submarine force do matter, but I draw your attention to that slide that I showed from ASPI. The transit times to get to areas of operations are the killer, because you get so little time on task. You still get some on task, so there still is a deterrent value, because people don't know whether you're there or not. But they're slow, and they've got other shortcomings. If you follow the model that I just proposed, there is no gap. If you don't lease those SSNs in the middle and or advance or accelerate our own nuke program, then maybe we go for others. But it's been ruled out by all the top level decision makers in Canberra as being a distraction, and that's my own view as well. But look, again, it's just like the previous question. We shouldn't rule it out totally, but starting up with any other production line, unless we get them built overseas, which is conceivable, would take time. Now, having said that, of course, we've just seen Israel order 3 submarines from ThyssenKrupp, and I think the delivery's 3 years or something. So, you know, you can do it quickly if you really have to. So the answer is yes, we could, but it's not the preferred option, and I don't think it's necessarily the only option. I think we've got other ways of dealing with the force structure, and that's what that table that I showed you was trying to illustrate. They've got to do some heavy thinking on that stuff.
Perhaps I can ask a question, if I may. Ken Broadhead, AUSI. In the days of sail, vessels ran out of fresh food because they were at sea so long. Yep. But now we're going to have submarines on station for similar periods, dependent on carrying consumables like food. So what? I mean, is it realistic that they can sit there for 70 days and still be fed? And what if somebody dies on board? I suppose that's a classical naval problem, but...
You're kidding. You put them in the freezer. I'm not kidding. It wouldn't be the first time it's happened. I mean, but look, more seriously on the food, they've got enormous cold rooms, cool rooms, and, you know, they've got chefs who are very versatile and so on. I mean, it's the name of the game. If you're in the business, that's what you've got to do. But what's more of a worry than people dying is if people have got a very serious injury or you know, that... But, I mean, a command of a submarine is probably the loneliest job you'll ever get. That they've got a mission, and if they in some way compromise that mission, they've got all hell to answer for. And if that includes less than optimum treatment for some injured sailor, well, you know, that's what you sign up for.
But RUSI, the media reporting that the US and the UK don't have nuclear submarines to lease. In other words, no availability of submarines.
And whose authority was that statement made on? As I've said, if you...
would you mind using this?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'll get back to where I should have been. If you got the money and the strategic and geopolitical circumstances warrant it, they'll be there. Now, the US may be less eager than the UK, but I don't think that'll be a problem. And the media stories are just the sort of knee-jerk type stuff saying that they're the same people who wrote saying you can't have nuclear submarines because you don't have a nuclear power industry. It's the simplistic sort of quick reaction type statement. They don't have them currently available sitting with a big ad that says for lease. True. But if we needed them, I'm quite sure we'd get them. We'd have to pay for it. And it might not be cheap, but I'm sure they'd be there if we need them. Same as keeping the production lines running in the UK to produce more reactors and propulsion plant. BAE Systems, you know, they're international business people. You come along with a good offer, they'll get on with it. It's not determined by elections, it's determined by commercial sensibility.
One last question.
Not a seaman type officer, a supply officer, but I had the privilege of going to the Nautilus back in the 50s.
Wow.
And she came round under the pole, and it was her first visit to the Pacific Fleet, and we happened to be over there in Melbourne for RIMPAC, and a small group of us were invited on board that submarine. I don't know whether she's still around, she'd be pretty old by now, but my question is...
exhibit in, I think it's in Brighton, Connecticut, if I remember right.
My question is, we presumably, our friends the Chinese have got large numbers of nuclear submarines, which presumably are up in the Indonesian archipelago and so on. Are our Collins-class submarines capable of keeping an eye on those nuclear-powered submarines? Because we always hear from reports of RIMPAC and places like that our normal submarines do extremely well in the exercises, but how in practice, how practical is it for a non-nuclear submarine to keep an eye on a nuclear submarine?
If you're talking about trailing, well, you're not going to be able to do it. To trail a nuclear submarine, you need another nuclear submarine. But it's not purely about trailing. The reason that they do well in the exercises in RIMPAC is because it's in a constrained exercise area, and there's a time frame when the exercise starts and finishes, and the submariners sit down and work out where's their most likely probability of finding targets. The same thing goes in international operations. The choke points, the straits and the areas of shallow water where submarines are more limited in their manoeuvring and so on, is where you look. You don't just sort of treat the whole ocean as being uniform. And the other point is that it's not just the submarine's own sensors, it's part of an international sort of Five Eyes and beyond type sharing of various information. So submarine probability zones are declared amongst allies, and they're refined, and every time the RAF flies P8s around, they're monitoring what's beneath them and so on, and it's all brought together in a manner that you can look at some areas are more likely than others, and that's the best you can do if you're conventional. But the conventionals are quiet, and what you hope is that when you are in the right place at the right time, when a nuke comes past, that you can hear them but they can't hear you.
Commodore Mike Flynn will give the thank you.
Before I formally thanks, I just have to say what a pleasure it is to see so many in the room, and it is a reflection of the quality of our speaker here today, which I think Chris has managed to be able to draw a huge topic down into, condense it to the form that he has. I congratulate him on the quality of his slides, they're excellent. Chris and I actually go back quite a long time. Although from different disciplines within the Navy, we shared a cabin on board HMAS Perth when it went across for its NTDS upgrade. We were privileged to have a two-man cabin. And I remember one of the engineers who had his own cabin actually got trapped in it because it folded up in the bunk and no one could find him on board. But that's another story for another time. My youngest daughter, my first child, our daughter, spent time during a social function in a large cabin that came out, a large trunk that came out from under the lower bunk while we were at a social function. That's not formally written into the DDG's terms of reference. What a wonderful presentation. I've got a couple of my points, and secondly, I think you should know that we are in the process of arranging a visit to Anstow, Lucas Heights. I've done it on 3 occasions, and it's a wonderful tour. And watch this space, March or April, the initial guidelines that I've been given. Now, I think it illustrates it, if I could use a pun, almost critical point in the evolution of strategy in Navy, and that Chris has brought that out, particularly with his reference to the bipartisan support that this has received, and that in itself, I think, is an achievement. Now, it's our usual custom to make a presentation to our honorary speaker, and it's very difficult to find something to give to someone who's got everything already, as you do at Christmas time. Chris has got not only a red tie, he's got the blue one, navy one as well. I believe he's got a crest at home. If he hasn't, I think we'll try and get it for him. The only thing I could think of actually was possibly a subscription to our journal. Chris, I've run out of options to give to you to thanks, other than to once again express my appreciation and admiration for the way you've presented them, and the only other thing I can do is ask the audience to applause.